Well, hello, good evening, and welcome to episode 75 of Humanity versus Insanity, the Crane Report. And as you can see, I'm joined tonight by Brian Gerrish.
Pleasure to be here. Thank you very much, Ian.
It's a pleasure to have you, Brian. Unusual for me to share the desk in the studio. And we're also joined by Mel Kelly, who is north of the border in Scotland, and we'll be catching with Mel in just a few minutes. But obviously the subject of tonight's programme is the events of the last few days. Now, last week, of course, I had Ollie Damagar as my guest, and we were discussing the events of the previous week and the phenomenal emotional manipulation that had transpired in the result of the Joe Cox incident. And although at AV7, I had predicted that the result would be manipulated to a Brexit win, for reasons that we will explain later, I must confess that I thought that the Joe Cox incident had probably created sufficient emotional swing that the result would be announced as a small Remain victory. So no one was more surprised than me to wake up at about 5 a.m. on Friday morning of last week to learn that a small Brexit win was being announced. Now, I'm just going to slip in at this point that Friday morning was exactly 7 years, 7 months, 7 weeks and 7 days after the global financial collapse in September of 2008. Now, the only reason I reference that, of course, is because of Christine Lagarde's infamous presentation last, I believe it was last May of 2015, where she made a very cryptic presentation referencing the number 7. So was she perhaps giving somebody a heads up? Anyway, the result of last Thursday, and I must confess that I found myself in the very unusual position of siding with Rupert Murdoch on this and proposing that people come out, although I think for very, very different reasons. And the Sun, of course, maintains its 100% record in that it has never lost an election since coming into the ownership of Rupert Murdoch. And of course, this is the bragging back page showing the headlines of the previous week. Believe in Britain, which was published 2 days before the Joe Cox incident, and then Independence Day from the previous Friday. And this is probably the most comprehensive set of results that I've seen in any one place. And this was published as the sort of front page to the Sun on, I believe it was yesterday. But this is the breakdown here. And we're going to look at this in a little bit more detail. But the final published result was 51.9%, i.e. 17,410,742 in favour of leaving, with 48.1%, which is 16,141,241 in favour of remaining. So, I mean, it was a relatively narrow margin, of course, but 1.3 million people being the majority. Now, Brian, we've been getting reports that those numbers may actually have been marked down over the true figure.
Well, anecdotal information, but we've certainly had reports from people who say they don't believe that this figure is true, that in fact the number of people who were going to vote to come out was much greater, that there was rigging. So I'm saying this is anecdotal, but it's very interesting. People saying they are not convinced that votes were handled properly, postal votes. Some people told they couldn't vote, arriving to give a vote and being told that they couldn't vote. So my gut feeling, I'm going to say, is that the actual leave vote was much higher. We had Joe Cox, that skewed it. Was there some manipulation of the actual vote? Yes, I think so. But basically, they couldn't swing it. That's my opinion.
Well, we also have reports of people turning up at polling stations being told that they had already voted, which is really interesting. Well, let's take a look at the breakdown through the 4 constituent components of the United Kingdom. And, well, it's not United Kingdom, Great Britain, of course, because Northern Ireland is in there. So we have England and Wales with a clear majority to leave. And in fact, the majority was supposedly reduced. The overall majority was reduced because Scotland and Northern Ireland both had a majority, supposedly, to remain. So, Mel, what are your thoughts on that? Because what we actually have, supposedly, is 62% of the population in Scotland voting to remain as part of the EU. And there's something a little incongruous here, because for a nation that is apparently pushing for yet another independence referendum, there's something a little incongruous about wanting independence and yet at the same time having almost 2/3 of the population in favour of subjugating itself to the European Union.
Well, it appears Nicola Sturgeon, like Rupert Murdoch, has some sort of magic crystal ball where whenever they make an announcement about how an election's going to go, it magically goes that way. So what sort of crystal ball do these people have that the nation's completely unaware of? It's called an IDOX election crystal ball, where every election's been privatised since 2013. And that way, Tories keep winning. Rupert's always right, and so is Nicola.
Well, let's have a look at that, because this is, of course, the IDOX manipulator. This is Peter Lilly, who does, I think, is it 8 hours a month work with them?
Yeah.
And he's paid something like £2,500 a month, for doing, which is about the average wage around, isn't it? No, a little more even than the average, £30,000. So he's paid £30,000 a year for offering 8 hours of his time as a director of IDOX, which is the privatised company that has responsibility for managing elections and primarily the postal voting system. So, yes, not too surprising that he has the inside track and is prepared to perhaps share that with David Cameron and co. Or maybe he's just told what result to deliver. But let's take a look at the other parts of the country, because England supposedly had 53.2% in favour of leaving. Wales was 52.5%. And Northern Ireland, just 44.2% in favour of leaving, the remainder in favour of staying. But let's have a look at the breakdown, because by generation, I mean, a lot is being made of the fact that the majority of the young generation wanted to stay in the EU, whereas the older generation, effectively, the majority wanted to come out. Now, one observation I would make here, of course, is that the older generation are the generation, certainly anybody who's over, 50, 56, 57, will have memories of what life was like before Britain entered the EU. And so what is interesting is the majority in that age group actually voted to leave and try and get a return to life in those days. Brian, what's your thoughts on that?
Well, I couldn't comment on the age thing, of course, but you're absolutely right, because you say people of a certain age can look back and you can remember what the world was. We knew that UK wasn't perfect. We knew that the institutions weren't perfect, but there was stability. Things worked. Transport worked. Okay, we then had problems. We could talk about the coal industry and all the rest of it. But you looked at the country. Did the civil service work? Yes, it did. Did local authorities work? Yes, it did. Did people in general tell the truth? Yes. So all these things you can tick off, and then you take a look out of the window today as a result of all the time we've spent alongside the EU, and every day of every month of every year that we've been alongside the EU in the media and the press is strife. There's never been quiet periods where everybody's happy. We just see constantly the EU is doing something different. It's causing us a problem. Then there's debate. So it wasn't difficult for me to look out the window and say, do we really want this thing, without even looking into the history of it. Younger people, what have they done in schools? Well, if we go to that wonderful organisation, Common Purpose, what Common Purpose was doing in a huge way was getting in amongst young people and promoting Europe. And they were doing it on a very simple thing. Europe, what a wonderful place to be, travel between different countries. And of course, that sunk into the youngsters so that Europe has become the norm. When you challenge that, some of them are getting pretty stroppy.
Mel, what are your thoughts?
I just look at this garbage the papers print and think, there's another Jackanory. I mean, like, they probably made that up in some G7 summit. Okay, what maps are we going to print? What results are we going to put out? And here's what Rupert's going to publish. Have we all agreed, boys? Yes, right, let's go. Let's go and perform a pantomime where the nation thinks they're participating, when in fact we have every single council's outsourced elections, every party's involved, but the nation's not to know about this wonderful privatisation of elections. So you've got 4 parties in Westminster, including the SNP, all colluding to use our council tax to privatise elections, put a Tory MP's private company in charge, and magically the Tories always get what they want. But the people have not to know that their vote's been privatised. Now, our grandfathers fought in a war, along with the people of France and other countries, to guarantee the free vote for these generations. And if the young people of this country realised that the politicians sitting in our Parliament in Westminster, in our Parliament in Scotland, and councils up and down the country colluded to privatise elections 3 years ago, and we were told nothing about it, and they actually used our council tax to fiddle the elections. So the free vote is what we were guaranteed by 2 world wars. And the generation that is a breed of greed, of dishonest people that have colluded across 4 parties since Thatcher came to power, that have stole the free vote from the British nation and fiddled elections since 2013. Well, that's treason in my book. Pure treason. And for them to sit and get their newspapers and Murdoch to publish their rubbish, the BBC to then spout the propaganda, when the BBC was told that ITV, STV, The Guardian, The Independent, The Daily Record, I personally phoned them all, sent the information of iDocs. Only the Herald in Scotland published the story to warn the nation that every council has colluded with the Tories in Westminster to privatise elections. So when it's not just the 4 parties, you can prove the entire British media has covered up this deception of Tories stealing the elections and SNP, Labour and Lib Dem councils paying for it.
Well, it may actually be, of course, that this wasn't the result they actually wanted. Maybe it's been manipulated downwards, as we have suggested, because it does seem from the anecdotal evidence that the actual outvote was probably significantly higher than the 52%. But they wanted to come up with something that was close enough to create the national divide and to create the anger, the venom, the vitriol that's being spouted, and a lot of it driven initially by the media and then people just latching onto it. But just to come back to this point of the age difference and the generation gap, I mean, for me, I was 18 at the time of the first referendum in 75. But I mean, the one thing that strikes me about the pre-EU era is that an ordinary working man, earning an average salary, could afford to buy a house or rent a decent property, could afford to support a family of 4, could run a car, particularly in the late 60s and early 70s, maybe not so much before that, and could afford to take the family on a couple of weeks holiday a year. And it was, in most cases, optional as to whether or not the mother, if the family had children, it was optional if the mother worked. And of course, under the EU, that is not the case. So we have actually seen wages diminish in purchasing power.
Disposable income.
disposable income has certainly diminished. Well, disposable income in a lot of cases has become negative. Which is why people are literally, even if both partners are having to work, are still actually having to borrow just to provide the fundamentals and the basics of family life. And of course, this is a lifestyle that is totally unknown to the younger generation. And, an observation that I made in a discussion that I was having with somebody a few days ago is that, for the younger generation, it's actually like Stockholm syndrome. Where basically the captives end up establishing a rapport with their captors, and end up actually defending their captors. So we got Stockholm syndrome coupled with the same sort of psychology as people who find themselves locked into abusive relationships, where they know what the prognosis is, they know what's going to happen if they stay with that partner, yet they keep going back for more, in the hope and the belief that something's going to change. And of course, nothing changes.
But there's some key points here, Ian. One of the things is we've got to remember the time, and I don't know the exact year, but originally local councils were not politicised. So you did not have a political party operating through a cabinet in a local authority. The moment they brought the political parties into local authorities, you ended up with a mini incestuous politics of Westminster. So we can see here in Plymouth, if Labour's in the Labour cabal, and you're only talking a few people, 4 or 5 people, controlling the whole of the city's politics, then the Tories will get in. And this is, of course, is repeated across the country. So that was I believe, a really retrograde step when we brought mainstream politics into local councils. We don't need it there, but it's there. Then they brought in the cabinet structure where they didn't even take a lot of decisions to full council. They were taken behind closed doors. And that's when we saw the vicious political agenda starting to control everything. So it wasn't a question of what local councillors felt their party could deliver to local people. What actually goes on is that centralised parties tell the local authority party what they're going to vote, what they think, what they say. This is like centralised
Well, we've seen this recently, of course, in North Yorkshire, where central government effectively instructed the Conservative representatives on the North Yorkshire County Council Planning Committee to vote in favour of Third Energy's request to frack their well at Kirby Misperton.
Right. Well, that's a classic example. We could go back to major developments when, of course, the government's planning officers are always there overriding what the local decision is. But I just wanted to bring in something else, because the moment we mentioned the BBC, what was the BBC doing in the Second World War? It was in charge of propaganda. That's what it was doing. Massive operation in New York, apart from anything else. And so we've seen a BBC massively skilled at skewing public beliefs, public values, and they were doing it. And the other thing we need to remember is the behavioural insights team. So the government now boasting that they've got their own unit controlled via the Cabinet Office, which says we can change people's views and values, and they will not even know that those views and values have been changed. Or if they do, they won't know how they've been changed. Now, the government is boasting, it's so confident about this unit that's now become a social enterprise company or something, but it's controlled by the Cabinet Office. So you've got a government actually boasting that it can control the way people think.
Well, and we know that they're employing forensic psychologists. So these are people who contribute to the playmakers, looking at how they anticipate people will behave given certain circumstances, like the Joe Cox incident.
Well, we had within the going back a couple of years within this cabinet office system, we had a French guy called Olivier Willier who was brought over. He was part of Sarkozy's private team. And his job was, he was a French expert basically on psychological manipulation of the masses, brought into meetings with the Cabinet Office in order to discuss how this was set up in UK. Now, if he was French, he wasn't there to talk about the benefit of this policy on UK. He was there to do something to do with British-French EU integration.
Yeah.
And Franco-British Council involved. So this is very, very sophisticated manipulation. And one of the reasons I think it is so dangerous is that, at least if you go back to communist times, if you lived in post-Second World War Russia or the East German bloc, everybody knew the government pushed out propaganda. So people knew it, they laughed at it, and where did they get their information? They went and spoke to friends or acquaintances or the underground. What we've got going on now is that people don't understand it's propaganda.
Well,
they look at the...
But it's to be fair, it's an increasing number of people that do reject it, which is...
I would agree with that.
Why we probably got the result that the British establishment didn't expect.
Okay, I agree with that, because we want to be positive out of this. But if we say, right, out of all the people who voted Remain, where did they pick up their views and values?
Well, not only where they pick up their views and their values, where did they pick up their vocabulary? Because, one of the things that I think we've identified is that, the words xenophobia and racist, and in fact, hate, xenophobic, racist, and hate, these three words have been used excessively by the Remain campaign and literally people latching onto this vocabulary. And what they don't realise is that they have literally been conditioned, and now they spit this vitriol out in an attempt to, it comes across as bitterness and, very, very sore losers. But of course, what it's also doing is creating phenomenal division. And, I've been speaking to somebody today who said that, that basically this is division within the family that they haven't seen since the miners' strike of '84. Yeah.
And it's deliberate. I have no doubt that this is deliberate. I think that the government has failed on its policy to get violence on the streets to do with immigration and Islam, whatever it is. If you think about it, this country's remained remarkably calm despite all of the rhetoric thrown around.
And the provocation.
Yeah. But now we've got something, we've seen a glimpse of it, where I had a young chap say to me the other day, he'd gone into work the Friday, so the day of the result, and he said work colleagues were spitting at people who said, well, actually, I voted Leave. He said he'd never seen or experienced anything like it. So there's a particular venom here, and you say, where's it come from? But you're right, it's now been driven down into families. So we're heading to how it must have been during the English Civil War, when you had families broken up or communities. And this is very, very nasty, sophisticated stuff. Is it orchestrated, without a doubt, by central government?
Now, Mel, this has got to be something that you guys in Scotland, I'm sure, experienced to some extent on the IndieRef in September of last year.
Yeah, Nicola and Cameron decided, let's practice in the Scots first. They like to use us as guinea pigs. But basically, let's remember, we are four nations: Scottish, English, Irish and Welsh. There's a fifth nation, the British. What have the British always done? Divide and conquer so that they could steal from people. So they did that to the Irish, they did it to India, everywhere the British go, then their remit is to divide and conquer and steal from people. Now, they don't have an empire to steal from anymore. So now all the Europeans are left with, by stealing from the people in the Middle East, is stealing from the rest of us. So how do you steal from us? Divide and conquer. How do you do it? Use referendums. They're fantastic for dividing people, but also distracting them, while both governments in Westminster and Scotland, and you will find in Wales and Northern Ireland, are pushing through taking away our freedoms. So the same week that they're trying to distract you with an EU referendum, where they've already decided the result and they've fiddled it, in the same week, that was to take your attention away from the privacy bill going through the Parliament. Now, Nicola Sturgeon did the same in Scotland. She was doing deals with Cameron. Now, this is the lady that toured England before the general election saying, trusting me. She's like, Car the Snake. England can trust me. I wouldn't do deals with Tories. Well, this is the lady that during the Scottish referendum did a deal with David Cameron so that to create a UK private water market together. Now, we had complete water independence because of devolution, and Nicola Sturgeon personally lodged the paperwork for David Cameron to change our devolved law to include Scotland and our water in the Westminster's new UK private water market, which Nicola said was a joint objective between the Scottish and Westminster Parliament. So while she tells Scotland, I want to split from the UK, while she tells England she wants to split from the UK, the whole time Nicola Sturgeon was creating UK markets with David Cameron behind Scotland's back.
Well, and now she's, of course, coming to his rescue, or trying to, because she has, over the weekend, been spouting forth that she's threatening to block Brexit in the face of English fury. And she's acknowledged that this actually will inevitably cause significant hackles to rise south of the border. But, again, one can't help feeling that this is part of the distraction process. And, of course, she was undermined anyway by Alex Salmond, who said, well, actually, Nicola, you can't block it. You can make a recommendation in Scottish Parliament. But the bottom line is, and here's Alex, he says he's admitted that the Scottish Parliament cannot block Brexit despite weekend suggestions by Nicola Sturgeon. Basically he's saying that Westminster ultimately has the power to override any of that. But what I do want to do is, for a few minutes, just go to Brian, because, we've talked 2 episodes ago. I was talking about the Bullingdon Club and how, like Skull and Bones in the US, which prepares its political aristocracy, we have the Bullingdon Club in the UK. And, of course, both David Cameron and Boris Johnson were contemporaries in the Bullingdon Club. Well, now a third member of the Bullingdon Club, and again a contemporary of both Cameron and Boris Johnson, is tasked with managing the Brexit process, which I'm not sure that actually means he's going to invoke Article 50, which of course is absolutely...
No, he's only just going to start... He's going to sort of start talking about the possibilities.
So we have a lot of, I should say, obfuscation. And, we're going to, in the sort of final minutes of tonight's programme, we're going to talk about, what it is that maybe we can do within individually and as communities to, try and make sure that this mandate is carried through. Because I think, as we're going to see, the ultimate agenda might not actually be benign towards the British population. But Brian, this is you've given us a quote here from Naomi Wolf, who was she's a journalist, but she was political advisor to both Al Gore and Bill Clinton. And she says, in a fascist system, it's not the lies that count, but the muddying. When citizens can't tell real news from fake, they give up their demands for accountability bit by bit.
I just found this such a brilliant and powerful quote, because it's to me it's so accurate. The fact, what do we see in the mainstream press media? It's spin, isn't it? We've seen stories that actually you follow them through and they're created on nothing, or it's a story where there's one particular fact and the rest is all spun from it. And this is pumped out in huge quantities, together with the soft porn, which is more and more over the news sites. And then people get into a stage where they can't really tell what's true and what's not, so they close down. And that lady, we could discuss who she is and how clever she is, or what, but that statement captures it. And we can say that is what is being done at the moment. Now, the good side is that we are also seeing that there are now so many different news sources, what you're pushing out, what UK column, a lot of other people on the internet, and people are going hunting. And this is one of the things that was pushed out after Joe Cox, is that people did actually go online to try and find out for themselves what was happening.
By the way, just an aside here, but I gather that Judge Nigel Swinney is appointed to hear the Thomas Mayer case. and it was Judge Nigel Swinney that was given the responsibility for hearing the Lee Rigby case.
Well, that'd be an amazing coincidence.
Really. I mean, out of all the judges.
Yeah. Well, if you've got a good judge, you should use
safe pair of hands, I think.
I would say so.
But anyway, so let's talk about Oliver Letwin, because we don't have as much time as we might like. But Oliver Letwin. So Oliver Letwin's been tasked with delaying the Brexit process.
Well, that's what I think he's going to do, because, of course, while it's delayed, they're going to carry on locking us into Europe. But Oliver Letwin is in the club with the rest of the boys, but he has been in the background now for months. And all of the information we are getting, and we're getting some very good information from Westminster, this is the man who is running the Tory party. He's running Tory policy. He's certainly been running David Cameron. Cameron is simply the puppet. The man behind pulling the strings in the first level is Oliver Letwin. He's in control of the behavioural insights. He's obviously running the Cabinet Office. He's running government. And now, by a strange coincidence, he's also the man who's tasked to run the Brexit unit. And who is he? Well, he's NM Rothschild. And if you have a look at the reports in the Jewish Chronicle, he's one of a number of Tory MPs, led by David Cameron, of course, where funding has come in from big Jewish backers. And I think we've got to ask the question, how is this allowed? How are these vast sums of money? I think for Cameron, from one source alone, it was £500,000.
And we've got Oliver Letwin, of course, who is a self-professed friend of Israel. And of course,
it goes without saying.
And also, of course, on the other side, working with Boris Johnson, is Michael Gove, who is a self-professed Zionist.
Publicly.
And also a friend of Israel.
Yeah, publicly, London stage, what is your first priority? Well, it's loyalty to Zionism. And then we put him in charge of education, as was. It's crazy, isn't it? But Letwin is an amazing man. I've just got a couple of slides if you want to do these pretty quickly. But you've got to go and have a look at the Duchy of Lancaster. So get into that. If you just click on, we can bring him up, because he's the Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster. And so he's part of the team looking after the Queen's money. So we've got a particular gentleman, his name's gone out of my head, of course, now, but you can find it on the internet, who is in charge of the Queen's purse. So very powerful man. And I've just tried to emphasise here, he's dealing with David Cameron. Well, David Cameron, of course, was a goner the moment this vote happened. I just love that picture of him with his boys, One Direction. So, there is only one direction for him. We've got the behavioural insights team. We've got Francis Maud is another very dangerous man, in my opinion. Of course, great friend of Julia Middleton from Common Purpose. So this is the team running government. It isn't David Cameron. It's never been David Cameron. It's Oliver Letwin, Francis Maud. These are the people with the real power. And Letwin, former employee of NM Rothschild.
And of course, author of Privatising the World.
Yeah, I mean, what more do you need to know? He writes a book, I think it was Redwood wrote the foreword to it, in which he sets out how to go about privatising everything. And since we've had Letwin in the background, everything in UK has been privatised. Well, we've got the roads still to go, but that's going to happen shortly. So we don't need to look far for these people. But I think that because they didn't expect this to happen with Brexit, that's why they've said we need a safe pair of hands. So finally, Letwin has come out the woodwork.
Well, and the good news is that more and more people now are starting to dig this out for themselves. Yeah. They're not getting their information from the mainstream media. They're getting it from multiple alternative sources. They're putting the picture together themselves and coming to their own realisation of what's occurring.
This is the way of doing it, because we are saying, you're saying, don't believe us, check it out for yourself. Mel's talking to us from Scotland and saying she's been finding out what the facts are. The information is out there in general. It needs to be put in front of people. So what is it, 16 million, 15 million people who think we should still be in need to be educated. And whilst there's many of the MPs who are clearly traitorous. They are on the other side. There's a lot of MPs who are simply ignorant and arrogant. So we've got to get out there and push this stuff in front of them as well.
Well, and as we were discussing earlier today, there is every intention of making it more difficult for people to access their MPs following the Joe Cox incident.
Yeah, well, local MP here, Gary Streeter, said he's so worried about his staff, not him, of course, his staff, that you're not going to have an open surgery. So you're going to have to book an appointment, which means you're going to get vetted. And then the next thing is, well, you've approached me too many times, you're vexatious. So what they're doing is putting a wall up now to stop people communicating with their MPs. It's very clever, very insidious stuff. But we've got to break through that. And I think if enough people are going to use the word pester their MPs, you're going to see these MPs not standing again. So the opportunity comes when there is another election. I hope there is one. And basically, if we do the right things, the bad guys are going to step away because they're getting very frightened.
Well, and if we take into account that 17 million people vote, I mean, the turnout was some 70-odd% of the electorate, one of the highest turnouts in living memory. But 17 million people, that's 70% more than voted the Tories into office in 2015.
This is what makes the thing so incredible, isn't it? You've got a government that would barely voted in, telling 17 million people we don't really care what you say.
Yeah. And I mean, and the irony is, of course, that the population of this country, being used to the democratic process here, is, well, I don't say totally relaxed, but understands that, if we're going to get a government, it's probably going to be elected by a minority. And in fact, I don't think there has been a time when more than 40-odd% of the population has voted a particular government into power. And most of the time, it's closer to 30% or less even. So here, we have 52% of the country, 17 million, 70% more than voted the Tories into office in 2010. It's a massive number. Now, we'll just go back to Oliver Letwin again here, because I want to bring up this slide that you've presented, which is 10 years old, in fact, but it's Team Cameron's big Jewish backers.
Well, this is the thing. The evidence is there. You can just simply go looking for it, and invariably you find it. Jewish Chronicle is a very good thing to read, because there's a lot of information about politics that never appears in the other papers. That's highlighting Lord Steinberg there, who's donated the 500,000 plus to Cameron, and there's other huge sums, 250,000, and on it goes. If you just hit the button again. And there, of course, we see other senior figures around the leader, include Oliver Letwin, head of policy. Now, this wasn't being talked about in the mainstream, the other mainstream press at the time.
But it's talked about in the Jewish Chronicle.
And this is where it's
And of course, it makes reference to the fact that, like Mr. Cameron, he's an old Etonian, but it doesn't go on to say that, like Mr. Cameron, he's a member of the Bullingdon Club.
Yeah. So, if you go looking for the information, you can find it there. But the minimum we're getting out of this article, isn't it, is that very big financial interests have put certain political figures in post. And when they're in post, why are they there? Well, they're going to be doing the bidding of the people who had the money to put them in the first place.
Absolutely.
It's very easy stuff.
He who pays the piper
calls the tune.
Yeah, exactly.
Absolutely. So, this is the thing. Research it. Have a look for yourself, and you will find all sorts of information there in the background. And I would say also, don't be prejudiced against publications. Don't think that because it's the Sun, it hasn't got good information in there, because you can find stories appear in the Sun, not in other places. Similarly, you could go and look at overseas publications will carry information. It's a big selection.
Well, the critical factor is to apply the filter.
Of course.
And decide for yourself what is relevant, what is factual, what is not, and don't just take it as gospel.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So, let's have a look here, because this is the Tories suggesting that they might avoid a general election. In other words, they're trying to find a means to stop Boris going into number 10, Donald Trump's twin brother, and they're suggesting that they could avoid the election if Theresa May is appointed leader.
Well, this is just incredible, isn't it? This is a sort of, this is Gordon Brown light, isn't it? You know, Gordon Brown just slipped across to become Prime Minister, and now they're saying, well, that Boris Johnson, he's a bit unruly, he's a bit of a wild card. So what we could offer you is Theresa May, because she's quite a well-dressed lady, she's very reasonable, let's get her in. But that's not what it's about, is it? Because Theresa May is unbelievably dangerous. She has set up the biggest spying organisation on the public ever seen in this country. We've got the Fixated Threat Assessment Centre, we've got the multi-agency public protection arrangement, MAPA.
We've got Prevent in schools.
We've got Prevent in schools, we've got excess powers to the Metropolitan Police and normal police forces. Then she's working closely with the security agencies. Social services now spying on people, and of course the named person scheme north of the border, absolutely classic. We're going to bring in taxi drivers to spy on people. Who set all of this up? Theresa May. You've got databases for local councils, all sorts of information.
Well, the Met Police set up the database. The High Court has ruled that it's illegal, and she still permits it to exist.
Of course, but there's a number of different databases being used by local authorities, social services, etc., around MAPA. There's a whole range of these databases. So she is not a safe pair of hands. She's a very dangerous pair of hands, but put across as the safe option.
Right, so let's have a look at here we go, the Brexit. Now we called tonight's episode the Brexit Psyop, and this is the call I made at the AV7 event, and I'm going to show you a link to that presentation at the end of the programme, where I made the observation that one of the potential outcomes here was a deliberate manipulation to present a narrow win by the Brexit campaign to deliberately destroy the country, and also to serve as an example to any other country thinking about going its own way. So just talk us through this quickly, Brian.
Well, very, very, very quickly. Just have a look at what's happened as a result of Brexit. So immediately David Cameron says he's going to stand down, so that introduces uncertainty. Then he says he's going to hand everything over to his successor to deal with Brexit. That produces delay. Uncertainty and delay, well, that doesn't take a country in a good place at all. So I'm going to say that's a psychological operation. You're undermining the country's well-being, to use that horrible word. He's chums with Boris Johnson. These people haven't fallen out. They haven't got different views. And what has Boris Johnson said in the last 24 hours? That the referendum was a little bit indecisive. He said if you think about it, it was a bit indecisive, and it doesn't matter because there's going to be closer EU cooperation anyway. And he was laughing. He's looking out the window of his car. I know the photograph's a bit small there, absolutely smirking and cackling because this is a psychological operation. The BBC, well, of course, biased all the way through, calmly says it's independent, absolute nonsense. In fact, I had to listen on Friday to the BBC calmly saying, well, perhaps we didn't actually give the EU enough coverage. It was mind-blowing. They didn't investigate why 17 million wanted out. They said, perhaps we didn't give the EU enough coverage. George Soros pops up and he says, well, Britain should be in the EU. And by the way, if you dare to leave, I'm going to smash the economy.
Except that he made a small fortune out of the Leave result by betting on the Leave result.
You want to do both ways, don't you? And then we attack Corbyn. Now, why are we going to attack Corbyn? Because we want to destroy the Labour Party. Because if you destroy Labour, as they've destroyed Lib Dems, there's one party state, which is Boris Johnson and Theresa May. And then the last bit, which is so telling, and Mike Robinson, of course, was smiling in a very big way about this, is Sadiq Khan is suddenly the centre as London Mayor for people calling for London to be a separate state within the EU. Well, of course, this is the city-state. This is what it's all about. And I think I'm right in saying that back in the very, very early UKIP days, papers were circulating which said, well, in the future, UK is going to be broken up into the 9 regions of the European Union, Scotland separate, Wales separate, England broken up. But London was itself a region. And now we're seeing it.
Wait, and by the way, I think we've got a picture. Here we go. This is a picture.
Yeah, well, just look at the face.
It's almost like he's giving a gesticulation, rather a rude gesticulation to the reporters there.
Well, and that's talking about it. It said, Boris Johnson says UK will continue to intensify cooperation with the EU. Well, the public have said we want to break with the EU. Shouldn't there be an immediate halt on anything pulling us in? And then there's the bit about the vote, not
entirely overwhelming. Yeah. So here we go. They're going to manipulate the outcome. But people say, how do you know? How do you know that the agenda is to destroy the nation state? Well, we simply read the scripts. And two academic examples of this, one from 1998, and these are freely available as PDFs online. And this one is a working paper produced on behalf of and for the International Monetary Fund, their Fiscal Affairs Department, titled The Demise of the Nation State, prepared by a Vito Tanzi, whose background is in international finance. And this is basically the outline as to how you go about destroying the nation state. And he actually talks about you actually create the small nations in the first instance, like Yugoslavia. You break up Yugoslavia, you break it into the smaller components, and then systematically you destroy and remove the independence of those smaller entities.
Ian, perhaps we could use just this little bit of wording here, because he talks about subnational governments.
Exactly. It concludes that a continuation of current trends would increase the importance of sub-national government while reducing in the economic sphere the importance of national governments. And that's from 1998. And then in 1999, and this is the Berkeley Journal of International Law, and this is a paper on the demise of the nation state towards a new theory of the state under international law. And of course, that international law that they want to apply is manifesting today as TTIP, CETA, and TPP. So now we come to really the crux of the matter here, and that is that basically the agenda is to use this as an opportunity to cause dissent, disruption, disagreement, total lack of cooperation, lack of cohesion amongst the British people. And whilst they're fighting amongst themselves, while you've got brother fighting brother, father fighting son, neighbour fighting neighbour, then they get on with their pernicious agenda, which is effectively to break down the economy. And ultimately, of course, the goal here is to have the country absolutely gagging to get back into a European superstate within the next 5 to 10 years.
This, of course, they were saying before the referendum, if we vote out, all sorts of bad things are going to happen. The economy's going to collapse. There's not going to be any jobs. This is going to go. So the fear. Now we've made the decision. Of course, they can do what they like and blame it on the public. So it's very clever. It's a very clever scam. We've just got to get people to see through it. Because most of the accusations are nonsense. The Plymouth Herald, local Plymouth newspaper, running a story that a mature lady trapeze artist can't get a job because of Brexit. That's what the headline effectively is. Mel's laughing, I think, absolutely true. When you get into the story, what is the real story? The real story is that she's done a variety of jobs all over the place, but pleased herself, she hasn't got a pension pot. So at the moment, she doesn't even get a state pension. So it's nothing to do with Brexit. Well, what does the Plymouth Herald? It spins the story that if you're a fairly mature trapeze artist, then Brexit has destroyed your living.
Well, once again, what people conveniently forget is that prior to entry into what was then the EEC and then morphed into the EU, but we had full employment in this country. And basically, I mean, I think there was about 250,000 unemployed, maybe a little over. But most of those were people in transit between jobs. There was literally estimated to be less than 100,000 long-term unemployed because there was plenty of work. And people who couldn't work were actually classified as unable to work and disabled, and society took care of them. Now, in the interim period, we've had the destruction. In fact, the destruction, of course, has literally occurred in the last less than 2 decades. But we've had the destruction of the Irish economy, the Greek economy, the Portuguese economy, the Spanish economy. Yeah. France is in a world of hurt right now. Deutsche Bank is struggling, and I know that trading today was stopped on RBS and Barclays. But this again is covering up other stuff, as we know. But the world today, with its massive artificial debt, is in a very, very different place than it was 44 years ago.
That's absolutely right. Absolutely right. And I was speaking to a German gentleman earlier this afternoon who was talking about the collapse of all the British industry. In fact, he also said he'd had the pleasure, I'll put that in inverted commas, of an evening meal with Gordon Brown. And he said to him, "You've got rid of the gold reserves." Yes, well, I've done that to facilitate agreement and discussions with the European Union. To which the gentleman said, "Well, do you expect to get that gold back?" To which Gordon Brown sort of gave a wry smile.
Well, and it should be observed, by the way, it should be observed that people who purchased gold at the turn of the century in the year 2000, 2001, today, if they had held on to that gold, then the value, the purchasing power of that gold would have increased by 34%, whilst everything else has devalued. Yeah. So the gold, funnily enough, same as the last 6,000 years, has actually been the solid, no pun intended, hedge against either the markets or, in this case, of course, the manipulation of the markets. Yeah. So, Mel, what do you see as the prognosis now in Scotland?
Well, because we've already had a referendum and they've had it all at each other's throat, Scotland's actually coming together. Now, what we realise is the problem isn't the union with the UK, the problem isn't the union with the European Union, the problem is the people in power in Scotland, in the UK and in the EU. It's the people that are the problem, not it's the elected officials that are the problem. So what we've suggested, and yes and no voters are coming together for this idea, is that we set up what's called a People's Second Chamber, where, like the Swiss, we can't trust the media, we all know that, so we create a People's Second Chamber where people serve like jury duty, supported by lawyers that serve like jury duty, to supervise Parliament. We have a people's paper, a people's website, people's apps, and the People's Second Chamber supervises Parliament. And instead of the party spin and Rupert Murdoch and the Daily Record and the BBC's version, what we get is the Second Chamber saying, "Your MP proposes today to steal your pension. Here's the positives, here's the negatives." And if the nation disagree with the politicians and the parties, then, like the Swiss, the nation decides. But instead of IDOC's elections, we have people's elections, where we can supervise every ballot box. It's clear ballot boxes, so that we know they've started empty. And this system is very stable in Switzerland. About 10% of legislation, like fracking, unnamed persons, then if enough people trigger to say, "No, I disagree with what the Parliament proposes," the nation decides, and they'll maybe take all those decisions one day in the year. But you would have a people's second chamber where people serve, and we can teach our children, look, we set up this system because all 4 parties in Britain colluded against the people, privatised elections and fiddled votes. So one day you'll be lucky enough to serve, and instead of being worm-tongue like Rupert Murdoch and the BBC, then you will give the nation the truth. We're an educated nation, but we're a misinformed nation. These people don't lead the country, they mislead the country. So what we do is have a body of people that serve like jury duty and rotate, so there's no party cliques, and they inform the nation. And they say, well, here's what they really want to do. And then the nation can decide. And as I say, there'll be no IDOX elections, no privatised elections, and each ballot box won't go anywhere. The local people in that town will see their own ballot box getting opened, and they'll see it counted, because we can have cameras. So at the end of the day, there is hope, people, because Scotland can do it first.
Absolutely.
And then roll it out across the rest of the UK. And then if the people want to form a federal UK, and then if the people want to form a federal EU, but only countries where you have people's second chambers supervising councils, supervising parliaments, supervising the EU. And then the way I see it is the time of kings is gone. The time of corrupt party power is over, and the time of people power has come of age. We live in the 21st century using a political system that was based on the only means of communication was the stagecoach. Well, sorry, we have got instant access to information, we can get the information, and we are entitled to have a people's second chamber to supervise Parliament so that the people of this country decide. And these two referendums proved, when you ask a nation to vote on a policy, people register to vote. When you ask them to vote for a party, we don't want to vote. Now, if we are such a sophisticated nation, we have been asked twice to decide, do we want independence from the UK? Do we want independence from the EU? So if we're entrusted with such complex decisions, then by God, when any bill goes through any parliament in Scotland or England, are we bright enough to scrutinise that bill and warn the nation, here's every clause and here's how they're trying to screw us over?
Absolutely. That sounds like a pretty good suggestion there, Brian.
I think it's a very good suggestion. And while you were speaking, Mel, I was thinking to myself, if you want an example of why this sort of people power works, you just take the jury. We know that the criminal politicians in particular terrified of juries because juries make, in general, good decisions in court. That's why we need secret family courts. This is why we need secret courts for matters of state. They're terrified of juries because people come in and display common sense. So what you're suggesting to me is almost like a jury to monitor the Parliament. The other thing I think that we need is to absolutely ban, to outlaw political parties. If anybody wants to be elected, they should be elected as an individual. Their background should be known, of course, so they come from the area they want to be elected in. Let's get rid of the parties because, of course, how do they control the parties? With the whips. And what do the whips use? Well, we know Tim Fortescue, Tory whip, on BBC video saying we used to blackmail them over the little boys. So let's get rid of the parties, outlaw them, let's outlaw whips, let's outlaw secret societies with very, in my opinion, very stiff penalties if you lie and get caught out with that. And then you've got a system there, Mel, that I think absolutely could work.
I absolutely concur. And I mean, it is a tremendous opportunity. And obviously there's a lot of emotion floating around right now. And, over the weekend, we've seen that there was something like 2 million people who put their name to a petition calling for a second referendum. And in fact, it's actually alleged that that was a Channel 4 prank that actually went live, and the BBC reported it as real. But there's also some investigation actually into that petition, because it does seem that the origins were somewhat suspect. But here's the petition that people absolutely know worked. 17.4 million people in this country voted to leave the EU. It is uncharted territory, certainly for the last 44 years. It's not uncharted territory to people in their late 50s and older. And, once upon a time in indigenous cultures all around the world, the elders were valued for their knowledge, their wisdom, their experience. Sadly, of course, and it's deliberate, in, as you call it rightly, Mel, the culture of greed wants to dismiss the input of the elders, those with experience.
Well, unless you're very wealthy, like Mr. Soros, because he's at least 1,200 years old, and yet, of course, his opinion's being pushed forward all the time.
Oh, absolutely.
And, so if you're old, you've got to be mega wealthy.
Yes, and you may not be too far wrong on his age either. But, the reality is that, what Mel has presented here is, a very workable outline. And of course, the other thing of getting rid of politics is we get rid of this left-right divide. And fundamentally, politics, maybe that's not even the right word for it, but it should be focused on humanity. It should be based on what is best for the individual, the family, and for the collective society. And I think that the sort of proposition that Mel's put forward, will do that. Now, a little over 2 weeks ago, 2 weeks before the referendum, I posted the second half of my AV7 presentation, where I addressed the issue that was actually avoided by both the Leave and the Remain campaigns. And one has to ask why both of these campaigns elected to ignore this massive elephant in the living room. Well, much to my surprise and shock, this video on YouTube, this is a screen grab from it. It's called EU Referendum, the plan to destroy the UK, although you can add whatever nation state you want to that, because it's all part of these academic documents. This is only two of a large portfolio of similar think tank and academic documents on the destruction of the nation states. But in that 2.5 weeks, as of an hour or so ago, it had 181,000 views on YouTube. That's more than 10% of the total views on my YouTube channel, which has been up for a few years now. And it's also on Facebook, and it's had some 45,000 views, I think it is, on Facebook. So it's also getting a lot of interest from other European EU member countries. So if you want to see what the issue is that is avoided, has been avoided by both campaigns, then take a look at this. It's 35 minutes. It's only the second half of the presentation, but it will give you perhaps another insight into what the agenda was had we remained in the EU. Hopefully, over the next few weeks, the division, the divisiveness, the bitterness, the vitriol, the venom will subside. And then we can start to focus on bringing people together and working together to find a replacement system where egos are put aside, where political ambition is put aside, and we focus on what is best for humanity. And at that point, maybe just humanity does start to find a way through the insanity that has been perpetrated on the human race for far, far too long. So, Mel, any final words?
I just think when you're saying about the hatred, what you saw Nicola do was tell an outright lie to try and whip up hatred in England, and Alex Salmond then contradicting her. Then we've got Tony Blair pretending he's running to the rescue, but using the exact same drum as Nicola Sturgeon. Let's have another referendum. So what you've got is Nicola Sturgeon, Alex Salmond, David Cameron, Boris Johnson, Michael Gove, now Blair, all working together to basically whip up hatred, whip up divides in this country, when really only the extremists like them and the liars like them were given a national voice. Well, this nation has got a voice, and this nation will say every party out.
Yeah.
And Brian?
Oh, brilliant. That's wonderful to hear. I would just emphasise this business that as long as people stay calm, they're thinking things through, they're discussing with their fellow men and women, we're on the right side, because we get caught up in the hate and the angst and everything else, and that just pushes us into what the other side wants. They want to get those riot police on the streets. We have got to be cool, calm and calculated. It doesn't mean say you've got to be soft with them. You can be very polite and reasonable in what you put in a letter, for example, but it can frighten the pants off them if you're pressing the right buttons. And also for people who voted leave, it may be difficult for some people, but I think it's really beholden on us to be showing reasonable behaviour with the other side, because if we can show that it is the hate and the vitriol on the Remain side, then of course we're winning both ways, because the people who support the EU are the ones that are nasty, and we turn the thing on its head. So, but one thing this vote has done is put a marker down. I don't think they wanted it, because for the first time people have seen a flag raised. They don't quite know what to do now, but the smoke's cleared. We can see we've got 17 million people who do know what they're talking about. If we can harness them, we can get them going in the right direction, we can give them more information, we're going to win more of the, whatever it was, 15 million who
and we need people,
voted the wrong way.
We need more people to get involved, because we know that there will be a game plan, an agenda to bring this country to its knees. How do we know that? It's written. It's written in these academic papers that we know what the game plan is. So our challenge is to offer an alternative, and for the type of proposition that Mel put forward a few minutes ago to evolve into a workable system. And it's really crucial that we start to focus on the things that we agree upon and not get bogged down on the things that we disagree upon. And if people want to just engage in vitriolic debate, then walk away, because that becomes vampiric. It sucks your energy. It sucks the will to carry on with your mission. Walk away. There's at least 17 million people, and probably a lot more, who are ready to try something new. Let's make sure that what evolves is something that is acceptable, not just to 17 million, but to 95% of the country, because everyone can see that it has the best interests of humanity at heart and not a handful of global corporatists. So thanks very much for joining me tonight. Thank you, Mel, for your wonderful contribution, as always. Thank you, Brian, for staying on in the studio here and joining me tonight. And I'm going to follow my own advice. I'm certainly not going to waste any energies on fractured communities. I intend to focus my energies on working to achieve the cohesion and coherence of an agenda that will bring people together in a system that has the best interests of humanity at heart. So thank you very much for joining me, and I will see you next Monday at 7:30.